Cold air clung to the ground like a second frost, settling into every crack between the barracks and drifting through the yard where the women stood in muted lines. The morning had begun with a silence that felt heavier than usual, a stillness that pressed against their ribs as they waited for the routine that governed each day. Breath rose in thin clouds from their chapped lips, and the dirt beneath their feet held the memory of too many nights slept in fear. Hunger carved shadows along their cheeks, and fatigue pulled at their shoulders, yet it was the quiet, the strange, watchful quiet, that unsettled them most. A distant rumble broke the air. The women turned toward the gate, dread tightening their posture as a U.S. supply wagon rolled into view, wheels crunching softly across the frozen ground. Supply crates were stacked in the back, their wooden sides marked with symbols the women could not rid. Crates meant change, and change rarely brought comfort. They exchanged wary glances, each silently asking whether this morning would strip away another piece of the little they had left. American soldiers approached the wagon, but something in their manner felt different. They moved slowly, almost gently, lowering each container with a care that made no sense. There were no sharp commands, no rushed orders, no signs of discipline meant to intimidate. Instead, the men worked in a quiet rhythm, passing the crates down as though handling something fragile. The unnatural calm spread across the yard and deepened the unease already threading through the women's breath. Whispers began in the line, soft, quick, fearful. Some thought it meant ration cuts. Others feared punishment disguised as ceremony. A few believed it was a test, the kind meant to catch them unprepared. Nothing about the soldiers' strange gentleness matched the warnings they carried or the routines they knew. The girl at the center of the group kept her eyes on the crates, her pulse tightening with every careful movement the soldiers made. Something was coming, something she could not name, and the quiet only made it feel closer. The women gathered in a loose circle near the barracks, their bodies angled inward, as if the cold alone were not enough to keep their voices low. Hunger gnawed at their ribs, sharpening the unease that had settled over them since the wagon appeared. Their eyes flicked between the crates and the soldiers unloading them, but their whispers stayed rooted in memories far older than this camp, shaped by lessons spoken in fear and passed from mother to daughter without question. They murmured about stories taught before the war, warnings that foreign food could be used to break a prisoner's will, that rations might be laced with something meant to weaken them further. Some recalled tales of captives humiliated during distribution, forced to fight for scraps under the watch of amused guards. Others remembered darker myths, ones that insisted sweetness itself could be a trick, bait, meant to lure them into vulnerability. None could say if these warnings were true, but war had taught them to believe caution over hope. One woman pressed a hand to her stomach as it tightened with both hunger and fear. She whispered that generosity rarely came without a cost. Another shook her head, insisting the crates held something dangerous. Why else would the Americans move with such quiet care? Their gentleness read as deception, a stillness before the blow. The girl who had watched the wagon arrive kept her eyes on the dirt, listening but saying nothing. The stories echoed inside her louder than the wind scraping across the yard. Yet when she looked up, she saw the soldiers arranging the crates with the same steady calm as before. No shouting, no hurried motions, no signs of mockery or malice. Their faces held focus, not cruelty, and the contrast unsettled her even more. Fear made more sense when met with harshness. But this quiet preparation felt like a riddle she was not ready to solve. The women drew closer together, relying on the myths they understood rather than the reality unfolding before them. Hunger demanded one truth, fear demanded another, and the camp held its breath between them. The sergeant stood near the supply wagon, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, watching the women gather and retreat in the same breath. The line he expected to form never did. Instead, they lingered at a distance, their bodies taut with hesitation, eyes fixed on the crates as though something inside might leap out and harm them. The cold wind moved through the yard, but it was not the cold that made their hands tremble. He noticed the way their fingers curled tightly into the fabric of their sleeves, trying to hide the shaking that hunger had etched into their bones. Faces drawn thin by months of rationed meals stared back at the supplies with a mixture of longing and mistrust. Shadows settling beneath their eyes like bruises time refused to fade. One woman shifted her weight, and he saw how her legs wavered before she steadied herself again, determined not to show weakness. Procedure told him to begin distribution, to call them forward, to keep the routine simple and efficient. But something in their posture stopped him. He could sense the fear beneath their stillness, the way they recoiled even from the possibility of kindness. He had seen soldiers flinch in battle, but this was different. This was a fear built long before they set foot in the camp, shaped by warnings he could not hear and histories he did not share. He set the clipboard aside and lowered his hands, letting them hang loosely at his sides. He did not speak. Words felt too sharp for the moment. Instead, he watched quietly, giving the women space to choose their own breath, their own distance. Their eyes met his only for a moment, but the glance carried something fragile, uncertainty wrapped in exhaustion. Compassion tugged at him, asking him to soften the line between duty and empathy. Procedure urged him to stay the course. He remained still, suspended between the two, aware that whatever happened next required more than orders. It required patience. The women stayed clustered near the edge of the yard, their bodies angled inward as though the cold itself were listening. The crates remained untouched, yet their presence stirred memories the women had carried since childhood. Warnings whispered in kitchens, in schoolrooms, in the quiet moments before sleep. They had been taught that foreign food could be a snare, that sweetness offered by an enemy was a trap meant to cloud judgment or soften resistance. Even a simple taste could mark them as gullible, weak, or disloyal. Some remembered elders describing meals used to deceive prisoners, luring them into lowering their guard. Others recalled lessons that spoke of dangers hidden in unfamiliar flavors, insistence that what looked generous often carried a hidden purpose. These stories had taken root long before war tore their world apart, shaping how they understood hunger, pride, and survival. Now, those old shadows returned with sharp clarity, threading fear into the empty spaces of their stomachs. Layered over those warnings was a deeper cultural weight, the belief that showing delight, need, or longing before captors was a loss of dignity. Pleasure belonged to safety, they had been told, and safety was the one thing they no longer had. To reach for food too quickly risked exposing the desperation carved into their bodies. To show gratitude risked exposing their loneliness. Even to appear curious felt dangerous, as though emotions themselves could betray them. So they stayed still, convincing themselves that distance was strength. Their eyes flicked to the crates, then back to the ground, fighting the instinct to step forward. Hunger gnawed at them, but pride held them in place. To accept something unfamiliar from their captors. Something that looked soft, sweet, or comforting, felt like stepping into a space where the rules that once protected them no longer applied. Across the yard, the Americans continued unloading supplies with quiet focus, unaware of how many stories they were working against. Their calm movements contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside the women, deepening the divide between intention and fear. And in that divide, the old warnings held their ground, shaping every breath the women took. The soldiers carried a small folding table into the yard and set it near the crates, the legs sinking slightly into the cold, packed earth. Metal bowls clinked softly as they arranged them in careful rows, each paired with a spoon placed neatly beside it. From a sealed container, a thin ribbon of frost drifted into the air, hinting at something cold inside. The Americans worked with deliberate calm, trying not to startle the women who watched from several paces back. But the moment the table was set, the prisoners shifted away as though the ground itself had grown dangerous. Their feet scraped lightly through the dirt, bodies pulling tighter together, faces turned toward the earth. Avoidance came faster than hunger. The women didn't move toward the bowls, didn't lean forward to smell what drifted faintly from the container, didn't allow curiosity even a moment to rise. The space between them and the table widened with every breath. The sergeant raised his eyes, noting the retreat. He exchanged a quiet glance with another soldier, both recognizing that no amount of neat arrangement would bridge the distance. They were offering something meant to comfort, yet fear wrapped around the women so tightly that even sweetness took on the shape of a threat. A woman near the back swayed suddenly. Her knees gave out before her hands could find balance, and she crumpled to the ground with a soft, startled gasp. It wasn't the table that frightened her. It was the thought of what it symbolized, the unknown wrapped in foreign care. Hunger had carved lines into her body, but fear had hollowed the strength beneath them. Two prisoners knelt beside her, shielding her from attention. The soldiers held their positions, resisting the instinct to rush forward. The sergeant's jaw tightened as he watched, the truth settling heavy and cold in his chest. The barrier before him wasn't about rations or taste. It wasn't even about survival. It was about trust, a kind shaped by years of warnings and deepened by months of uncertainty. Trust so fractured that not even sweetness could reach across it. The sergeant stood still for a long moment, his breath forming pale threads in the cool morning air. Then, without a word, he took several deliberate steps backward from the table. The movement was slow enough for every woman to follow it, gentle enough to signal that nothing more would be asked of them. His boots came to rest well beyond the crates, placing a wide stretch of untouched ground between himself and the food he had arranged. The change in distance shifted the atmosphere in ways more powerful than sound. Shoulders that had been locked in tension eased by a fraction. The clustered group loosened slightly, as if a cord pulled too tight had finally been allowed to slacken. For the first time since the morning began, the women let air into their lungs without rushing it out again. Their breathing steadied, soft and uneven, but no longer strangled by fear. Thin vapor drifted upward from the open containers, curling into fragile shapes that rose in the cold air. The warmth carried no command, no threat, only the faint promise of comfort. The steam softened the harsh lines of the yard, blurring the edges of crates, coats, and distant fences. Even the metal bowls seemed less severe beneath the gentle haze, like something set out for guests rather than prisoners. One woman near the front lifted her eyes just a little. Her gaze landed on the sergeant where he now stood, hands lowered, posture open, waiting without expectation. She did not move toward him, but she did not look away. Her stare held for a moment, thin as paper, fragile as trembling breath, and then shifted back to the table. It was not trust, it was not acceptance, but it was the first quiet acknowledgement that distance could be safety, and that safety could be the beginning of something else. The sergeant approached the crates only long enough to lift the first metal lid, letting the rising steam blur his outline before he stepped back again. A thin layer of frost clung to the rim, trembling as the warmer air touched it. When the lid came away, a soft gasp rippled through the cluster of women. Quiet, involuntary, almost lost in the morning breeze. Inside the container, pale swirls of melting ice cream softened into gentle curves, the surface shimmering where cold met warmth. No one stepped forward. No one dared. They stared as if the sight itself could not be real, as though this must be another trick of hunger or exhaustion. The faint sweetness drifting upward carried none of the danger they had been taught to expect, yet fear held their hands frozen at their sides. For a moment, the melting cream seemed to mirror the tension inside the yard. Solid edges weakening, loosening, slowly changing shape. The sergeant saw the shock settle across their faces, not in fear this time, but in a kind of trembling confusion. He felt something move inside his chest, a quiet ache he refused to show. His jaw tightened, not from frustration, but from the effort to hold back any reaction that might overwhelm them. He lowered his eyes respectfully, letting the space between them remain open, controlled, and safe. The women leaned closer without moving their feet, as though the unexpected softness inside the container challenged everything they had believed about the men who guarded them. The sweet scent rose steadily, a quiet offering with no demand attached, and in that simple contrast the sergeant felt his internal conflict sharpen. Procedure told him to serve. Compassion told him to wait. Both held him still, and the ice cream continued to melt, the moment softening into something none of them yet knew how to name. They placed the bowls one by one along the packed dirt, each set down with a quiet care that carried more meaning than any spoken assurance. The metal touched the ground softly, scarcely disturbing the dust. No orders followed. no gestures urging the women closer. When the last bowl was laid in place, the Americans stepped back as a single deliberate movement and then continued retreating until they stood far enough away to dissolve the sense of being watched. For a long moment, nothing happened. The yard held its breath. Thin lines of melting ice cream traced the inner rims of the bowls, gathering in slow droplets that cooled the air with a faint sweetness. The women stared at the small offerings as if they were objects from another world. Too gentle, too vulnerable, too impossible to approach without reshaping everything they believed. The distance left behind by the soldiers grew into a quiet invitation. It was space without command, space without fear, space shaped by patience alone. Shoulders softened first, then the tight folds in their posture eased as they stole uncertain glances toward the men who continued to wait without expression. The warmth rising from the containers behind them mixed with the cool morning breeze, softening the silence into something less rigid. One woman moved a single step forward. The motion was so slight it barely lifted the dust beneath her feet, yet it broke the stillness like a dropped pin in an empty hall. Her breath trembled as she reached out her hand, hesitating above the closest bowl. The surface of the melting ice cream shimmered faintly, catching a sliver of light. Her fingers touched the edge first, testing the moment. Then, with a small pull of courage, shaped by hunger and something deeper, she lifted the bowl from the earth. A quiet shift swept through the group, a fragile release, a beginning, a return to something they had nearly forgotten. She lifted the spoon with a hand that still shook, the metal trembling lightly against the rim of the bowl. For a moment she only stared at the melting surface, watching the thin layer soften and pool along the edge. Then she brought the first small bite to her lips. The cold touched her tongue like a forgotten memory, startling her more than comforting her. She paused, eyes widening not from fear, but from something gentler, something unfamiliar. The taste settled slowly, sinking through months of hunger, silence, and caution. Her breath faltered. A thin tear escaped before she could blink it back, slipping down her cheek with quiet determination. It was not a sob, not an unraveling, just a single line of warmth in the cold morning air. Another woman stepped closer, drawn by the faint change in her expression. She reached for a bowl of her own, hesitating only long enough to look toward the Americans standing at a respectful distance. Seeing no movement, no pressure, she took a tentative bite. Her lips parted in surprise. A whisper escaped her, barely louder than the steam rising from the crates. More women gathered, speaking in soft, tentative breaths, as the sweetness stirred something long buried beneath caution. The Americans kept their distance, their posture steady, their hands lowered. They did not move closer or break the quiet. Their presence remained a boundary of safety rather than control, a reminder that this moment belonged entirely to the women. As the ice cream continued to melt, the tension began to melt with it. Small tears glimmered on several faces, each one carried gently by the cold air. The whispers grew, not in volume, but in number, forming a soft murmur that felt almost like the beginning of trust. A fragile warmth rising against the morning chill. The first woman held the bowl close, as if the warmth of her hands alone could keep the sweetness from vanishing. She tasted another small spoonful, letting it rest on her tongue longer this time. A memory stirred, faint, blurred, softened by distance, but present enough to shift her expression. She lowered the spoon and whispered something fragile, a name or perhaps a place. The sound carried away before anyone could fully hear it. Another woman stepped closer, bowl pressed against her chest. She murmured about a festival from years before the war, when sugar was still something a child could taste without guilt, when vendors lined streets with treats the color of summer fruit. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not with drama, but with the recognition of how far those days had slipped behind them. The others listened, nodding gently, each one searching her own memory for something similarly untouched by fear. The sweetness in their bowls was simple, cold, melting, ordinary by any other measure. But here it became a bridge. It connected the present hunger to lives that once held small comforts, meals shared without rationing, and moments where laughter wasn't a risk. They spoke in quiet fragments, offering pieces of themselves cautiously, their stories shaped less by words than by the pauses between them. Some recalled the years when war stripped markets bare and replaced childhood with duty. Others remembered standing in long lines for rice that never arrived. A few described the silence that followed each loss, the way streets emptied, the way sweetness disappeared entirely, the way they learned not to expect anything gentle again. As they ate slowly, almost reverently, the realization settled among them. This simple taste was not about indulgence. It was about remembrance. It reminded them that life once held moments without fear, that sweetness once existed without consequence, and that somewhere beneath the weight of everything they had endured, they were still capable of feeling something other than survival. The myths they carried had been heavy, built from warnings repeated through childhood and sharpened by months of war. Those stories had painted Americans as men who would use food as punishment, who would humiliate the weak, who would twist generosity into a trap. For so long, those fears shaped every movement the women made, every glance they dared to lift, every uncertain breath taken when a soldier stepped too close. Yet the morning's quiet act stood in stark contrast to everything they had been taught. No raised voices, no force, only bowls left gently on the ground and a patience that expected nothing in return. As the ice cream melted across their tongues, another realization began to take shape. The sweetness did more than comfort their bodies. It softened the hard lines of belief etched into them. Each hesitant bite pushed old warnings further into the background, revealing how brittle those myths truly were when placed beside the simple truth of how these men behaved. The Americans kept their distance, not out of coldness, but to spare them fear. They watched without expectation, letting the women's trust rise at its own fragile pace. The dessert, humble and melting, became something larger than any of them expected. It was not a luxury. It was proof, quiet, undeniable, that compassion could survive where violence once ruled, that gentleness could exist even in a place shaped by conflict. For the women, it marked the moment when stories from home began to loosen their grip, replaced by an understanding born not from orders or speeches, but from a kindness offered without condition. By the time the bowls were empty, the myths that once defined their captors no longer seemed certain. What remained instead was the truth revealed in small gestures. War could command fear, but it could not erase humanity. And sometimes, one unexpected act was enough to show the difference. The bowls lay empty beside their hands, still warm from holding something they never expected to taste in captivity. The morning air, once sharp with suspicion, felt softer as the women sat in a loose circle. Their fingers curled gently around the metal rims, as if holding on to the fading echoes of sweetness. No one hurried to rise. No one feared the silence. It felt, for the first time in months, like a pause not forced by fear, but offered by the world itself. Across the yard, the Americans kept their distance, their movements unintrusive and quiet. They understood that the moment belonged to the women alone. Nothing more needed to be said. Nothing more needed to be given. The simple act had already traveled farther than any command or explanation could. It joined the long, quiet lineage of humanitarian gestures that had unfolded across scattered camps and broken nations during the war. Small mercies offered when brutality had grown too common. The women looked at one another with eyes no longer fixed on the ground. Their breaths came steadier, their shoulders less tense. The myths that once shaped their terror did not vanish in an instant, but something inside them loosened, as if a knot had finally begun to unwind. They had seen gentleness where they expected punishment. They had tasted warmth in a place built from conflict. And in that realization, a breach formed between the world they had feared and the one they now inhabited. As sunlight crept across the camp, melting the last thin layer of frost, it became clear that the change was not just in the air. It was within them. War had divided, hardened, and taught them to expect the worst. Yet here, in the quiet aftermath of an unexpected kindness, they understood a truth that had survived even the darkest years. Humanity, when offered without demand, could heal more than hunger. It could begin to heal the heart itself.